So welcome. This talk is about Eclipse Mita, which is aiming to establish a new programming language for the embedded IoT. And it's really sort of coming back to what Benjamin just said, those sort of three blocks, three sections of the IoT. We're sort of sitting on the lower side, on that side of the slide, sort of on the device side of things. And to give you a feeling for what we're trying to do, we'll walk through a very quick example of how Mita looks. It's not intended to really, get all the details, but to get a rough idea of how this feels like. And so in this demo, we're going to build a device that gets installed in, say, a storage room, and we want to count how often the light gets turned on, so how often that room is used. And whenever that happens, we also want to send the temperature data, sort of as a smart building kind of solution. And so Mita is an event-based language, and time is an event too. So I can do things like every 100 milliseconds do something. In this case, I want to read the light level and build on that. So I'm going to read my light sensor, scale that to a unit that I want to work with, and then compare that to the previous light level. And if that changes according to a certain threshold, then the light was just turned on, right? So now I want to send that out, say through MQTT over Wi-Fi. So I have to set up my Wi-Fi connectivity. And in here we use the ECE Wi-Fi with the correct password. And then I set up my MQTT connectivity. And notice how it refers to the Wi-Fi that we previously set up and the topic that I want to write to, so say sensor events. And now further down, I can just write to that topic. So literally it's called write. And I send a JSON message, which I can build up using string interpolation. And even here, while building that string, I can read the sensor data. And now we also want to count how often the light was turned on, so I'm going to remember that and put that in that JSON string as well. Right. All of this code produced C code that we can inspect and modify if need be, and also flash to a device which we have prepared. And if the demo gods are good to us, then this demo will work.
So I'm gonna move the light over. We tested this in a bit of a brighter room, so
yeah,
there we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. We did this in a bit of a brighter room, so I need to use a bright light.
Our thresholds are a bit off, but
yeah.
We saw that one message come in there. That's already enough, right? Yeah. So you saw the message coming. It's a matter of tuning the thresholds at this point. But that was sort of the quick hello world of what Mita can do. But let's take a step back and think about why do we even need to build another programming language? I mean, this is really not an obvious thing to do. And one interesting observation with the Internet of Things is that we really have two worlds coming together here. On one hand, we have sort of the cloud world where we talk petabytes and virtually unlimited resources. And on the other hand, we have embedded devices which are very resource constrained, right? We're talking kilobytes of RAM, maybe a megabyte of flash or two, and very limited computing power. And at the same time, we want those devices to live a very long time on battery, right? So really two extreme ends of the spectrum. And yet those two have to come together. And one interesting observation on that sort of low-end side of things, on that resource-constrained side of things that we're seeing is that the effort that is needed to scale those out over quantity has those sort of steps in there, right? So in the beginning, you might start off putting a bit of hardware together on the breadboard, and that works well for, say, 1 to 10 devices, but you incur effort every time you want a new one. At some point, you realize that this is too much effort and start building your own PCBA. Once you want to bring those, say, into a field trial, you need to look at things like certification, Radio Equipment Directive, CE certification, etc. And certainly once you're talking industrialization, turning this into a product that you can sell, effort goes up even further just because of, say, certification. That's how it, say, used to be. What we're seeing now is that there are devices such as the Bosch Cross-Domain Development Kit, which are sort of universal hardware. They have pretty much any sensor that you might want to use. built in already, and in case they don't, they have an extension bus that supports that. And what those devices do is, on the hardware side, they really flatten that curve, because you have one bit of device that you can take from quantity 1 or lot 1 to, say, 10,000. So universal hardware set. And the Bosch XDK is just one example of that. There are others that try and do similar things, like from STMicro, you can get boards that have a lot of sensors and connectivity built in already, which you can then also have customized once quantity or your business case allows for that. And instead, they do that by having all the sensors built in that you might need. Interestingly, software hasn't quite kept up with that. So when you start with, say, prototyping devices, very quickly you'll be using Arduino or something like that, which doesn't really scale across quantity, because you really want a lot of control over what happens on your device. Once that device is in the field, it's going to be very, very hard to update. So you really want to be sure that before you ship it, you'll have ironed out a lot of bugs. That means that very quickly you'll be using things like the vendor libraries, say the STM32Cube, which adds another level of complexity unless you're a seasoned embedded developer. And then testing and certification add their own challenges to the mix. And so what Mita really does, or tries to do, is it tries to lower those barriers. It tries to sort of flatten that curve on the software side, as we are seeing happening on the hardware side of things. So what that means is we need a way to program devices that, for one, feel good to a wide range of users, and this is a really soft target to achieve, right? But there are other programming languages that that have an explicit goal of programmer happiness, and this is in a way what we're trying to get as well. That also means that convenience matters. So to get those effort steps down, we need to be quick while writing code. So abstractions are really important. At the same time, we don't want to annoy power users. So those who are embedded developers, those who do know the nitty-gritty details, we want them to be able to still bring their full experience to bear. At the same time, we want that scalability to production. We want to be able to afford that level of control that we need, say, during testing or certification, and also to inspire trust in the software that we write, so that we're sure that it behaves the way we expect it to. And lastly, all of this on a really low power hardware. So kilobytes of RAM rather than megabytes, kilobytes of flash rather than megabytes. That also means that things like garbage collection are out of the window. Also, when it comes to, say, deterministic time behavior, garbage collection is not really something you can afford. So, that event just happened. Oh, by the way, I have to garbage collect. 100 milliseconds later, event's long gone. Right? So it's not happening. So how do we do this? At the moment, most embedded, at least on that level, most embedded devices are programmed in C. And what Mita basically does is it is a transpiler that transpiles to C. This is an idea that we've seen used in other environments too. Think TypeScript or SAS, Less, etc. CoffeeScript, you name it. And Mita follows a very similar approach. So we've already seen in the demo that Mita is an event-driven language, and in that quick demo we've seen time used as an event source, but there are obviously others. So on the XDK, for example, you have buttons that can be pressed. Those are obviously events, but also sensors have a lot of pre-processing that happens inside them. So, for example, the accelerometer in this device can detect when the device is in free fall or when it's being moved. And with those events also come energy savings. So your microcontroller is going to be sleeping for a lot of the time, and every now and then when an event happens, it's going to wake up, process that event, maybe send some data out, and then go back to sleep. Right? And this is how we achieve long battery runtime. And this is really reflected in the language on a design level. Then memory management is quite a topic. I said garbage collection is not really feasible on that level of resources that we have available. So we are shooting at static memory management, meaning that all memory is allocated on the stack. And if you've written C code, then you'll be somewhat used to that. except that we do that for you when we can. So we sort of do a worst case memory analysis where possible and allocate that memory on the stack beforehand. It's also completely statically typed. There's no such thing as void pointers or anything like that, so you'll be type safe. And you get direct access to system resources. So we've already seen in the demo as well that we can, for example, directly read from a sensor, and we don't have to manually set it up beforehand. We can, of course. So if the default configuration that the sensor ships with does not work for us, we can change that. And lastly, is already said and seen, this transpilers to C code, which is a really important feature in itself because it means that you can inspect the code that implements your program, and you can modify it once you hit the glass ceiling that is inevitably there, right? So that for a long time to come, maybe ever, there's going to be things that you cannot express or do in Mita. And at that point, you can always fall back into C. We also have sort of integration with the C language so that you can mix and match both at the same time. Right, let's have a bit of a closer look at how Mita looks like. When you look at that bit of code, without going too much in detail, it shouldn't look too foreign, right? So if you've written something like TypeScript or Swift, Scala, to some extent Go, this is going to look somewhat familiar. So a lot of things, like the obvious things like imperative constructs, for loops, if, etc. is there. We have mutable and immutable variables. And notice how those variables don't have a type explicitly written on them, because for a lot of things we can actually infer the type. So even though it's statically typed, we have, at this point, quite powerful type inference that will take that off your hands. Then there is a feature that other languages have too, which is called extension methods. So if anyone's familiar with Eclipse Extend, they do that. C# has something similar. The basic idea is if you have a function, you can write the first parameter on the left side. So if you look at that mean function down here, it's called the way you would normally call a function, but you can also write values on the left side. So in Go, this is similar to receivers, for example. And the benefit of that is that it provides an object-oriented feeling without actually being object-oriented and without incurring all the complexity of being object-oriented. And the standard library Mita, for example, is implemented that way. So if you want to know the length of an array, you're going to be calling array.length, and really it's just a length function that takes an array as first parameter. We have built-in memory management, and this is particularly apparent when it comes to strings. So strings in C are notoriously painful, and this is something that Mita takes off your hands as well. So here, for example, we know that the string that we're building here, in worst case, is 23 characters long, so we're going to allocate that bit of memory, and then do string interpolation into that buffer. You can also return strings from a function, for example, and the way that works is that we analyze how long that string that's going to come out of that function is going to be, worst case again, allocate that on the stack, and then pass in the pointer to that bit of memory. Right, so that's sort of the imperative side of things. Mita also has a strong declarative side, particularly when it comes to the resources that are available on the system, right? So your hardware is going to have, particularly universal hardware, is going to have several sensors, several means of connectivity. And in Mita, you can set up those bits of sensors and connectivity in a declarative manner. And the benefit of that is that we can validate your configuration before it even touches the device, which is unlike, say, using an API to configure your device, where, if at all, you're going to find configuration errors at runtime only. So concretely, for example, we want to set up the accelerometer on that device, and we can just write setup, name of the resource that we want to configure, and then we're given a set of configuration items that we can set. And what type of configuration and what type of resources are available is described in what we call a Mita platform. So for the XDK 110, for example, there's a platform. For the Arduino Uno, there's a very prototypical platform, and others are in the making. These sort of setups can also be named. So again, we've seen that earlier with the MQTT example, or here with the lightweight M2M example. You configure, say, your Wi-Fi, and then can use that to send lightweight M2M messages over Wi-Fi or, say, MQTT. What you get down here, this shock detected bit, is something that we call signals, which you can think of communication channels with the outside world. And what a particular signal actually is really depends on the resource that you're setting up. So in case of lightweight M2M, we're talking about properties. In case of Bluetooth Low Energy, there would be characteristics. In case of a REST API, those would be resources. In case of GPIO, there would be a physical pin on your device, etc. Right? And this is really defined by the particular resource that you're configuring. All right, the GPIO side of things, we're going to see examples of that later. This slide is basically to say that this setup mechanism works not only for seemingly high-level resources such as MQTT connectivity, but also for the low-level stuff like I2C or GPIO. Those resources that you can set up, you can also interact with directly in your code, so you can read and write to sensor values or the signals that you have previously set up. And the whole thing, as said, is event-driven. And the way we do this event handling at the moment is that we have an event loop. And whenever an event happens, it gets pushed into that event loop and then executed one after the other. This means that hard timing constraints are out of the window, but it also means that your code always executes in the same context, which is very convenient from a programmer's perspective. So you don't have to take care whether you're in an interrupt service routine or not, because you're always in the same task context. All right, in a nutshell, wrapping things up, again, given a feeling for things, this is a very similar example to what we've seen in the beginning. It basically takes data, builds an JSON string out of that, and sends it out of MQTT every 10 seconds. So we have those events that happen at regular intervals or when sensors trigger them. We have imperative code that looks very similar to other languages that are already out there. And then we have the declarative setup that configures the hardware on which our program is going to run on. There are loads more features that we haven't covered yet. But just for feeling, those 29 lines of Mita code for the XDK 110 expand to 842 lines of C code. Right? And that's not because our generators are particularly inefficient. It's just because C code is fairly verbose when it comes to building systems like that. All right, and with this, I'm going to hand over to Simon, who's going to show how that's used at Bosch.
Yeah. Hi. I'm going to show you how we use Mita at Bosch to... I need that for 2 slides.
Yeah, sorry. Too quick there.
Yeah. How we use Mita at Bosch to both develop proof of concepts very fast and how we do testing of the XDK 110 platform, because writing those platform generators is good and all, but we need to be sure that they really work. So first off, as a proof of concept idea, we want to say we want to detect people in a smart home, because that's also very important. Like, you might want to know if people are still in the room, if a fire happens, or if toilets are being used, so you can clean them more efficiently. Like, if they're not being used, you don't need to clean them all the time. And if there's a conference where, like, every 2 minutes all toilets are used, then you might want to do that a bit more frequently. But you can't use cameras in toilets. So we are using a 8x8 infrared sensor array here, for example. This is the Panasonic grid eye. And its output looks like this. And as you can see, you can't really see naughty bits of people, but you might still be able to detect people because they are a lot warmer than the environment. And now I'm going to show you the code for this. And give you a quick walkthrough. There we go. So obviously we want to do this without wires, so we need connectivity, so WLAN and MQTT, as you've seen before. And then this sensor talks over I2C with our device. So we can basically take the datasheet and put it directly into the code, right? We just look up what's the device address over I2C, put that in there. And we have some registers. Those are even multiple bytes long, and then Mita will generate code that will read multiple bytes at once, converts it into an integer or even into an array of multiple byte integers. And you can easily configure byte order here. So you could say, I want my device talks big endian, and then automatically conversion will happen, and you don't need to know what the XDK has, what the XDK's byte order is, because the platform maintainer knows this, so we know this. Then we have some LEDs here that will tell you if somebody's on the left or the right. So I'm configuring those. And then it's basically, we can do program logic. So every startup, we want to first initialize the grid eye because it's not a built-in resource. We need to do startup manually. So we'll set some registers to configure it. Maybe you want to do some calibration, which I've put into another file because it's not that interesting. But you know, every time we press the button 1, we'll do calibration. Then we'll have some global state, like count how many people are on the left or on the right, and then do event handling. So every 100 milliseconds we get the image, iterate over its rows and columns, and detect if somebody's there. At the same time, we're building a string, which we've allocated at the start. So here we actually need to say how long our string is going to be, because in loops it's very hard to do inference over size. But you can do this manually, so you have enough RAM allocated here, and can then write to the string, and at the end write to the backend. And if the demo gods are nice to us again, we'll see a live image here, and so you can see that we have very nice detection of people here. It works pretty well, and yeah. So maybe back there it's a bit too far, but you know, for shorter ranges, this works pretty good. All right. The other thing I promised you was automatic testing. So let's maybe for another 2 slides we need to switch again. Like I said, we need to test this implementation of the platform, and for this we've got hardware in the loop tests. So you can see the violet cable there is the loop, and the hardware is attached to it. So what we have there is an XDK connected with the XDK. I always forget what's the name. I think it's called Bridge or something, which just exposes the GPIO pins to be more accessible. And what we do here is every 1 second we toggle a pin, and it's connected to another pin, which we then pull all the time and see if state changes, and if it does change, we'll send out a message over serial console. And that we can then connect with Python and do unit tests. And as you can see here, configuring GPIO is just as easy as configuring I2C, configuring MQTT. You say which pin, what's the initial value, or you know, if you want to pull push or pull down, pull up. And then we plug that into a testing environment. So we have a Jenkins coordinator which sends the Mita code to a build slave, which compiles all this to C code, compiles the C code of the SDK, which is a bit more complicated, which is why we're doing this on a separate build slave, a powerful computer. And then the build firmware is sent to a BeagleBone, which flashes the XDK, runs it, and checks the output. And with this process, we can, you know, very easily write unit tests and see if our device behaves the way we want it to. Right. Yeah.
Right. So, summing things up and like the takeaway message, Mita is a new. So I should settle on how to pronounce it. Is a new programming language for the embedded IoT. and it enables fairly high-level features that transpile to C. It is open for everyone. We're proudly an Eclipse project. We're out there, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
So what platforms besides the XDK do you already support?
The Arduino Uno, and we are very open to getting new platforms. So if you have one, then we would be really happy to support you in making this.
So at the moment, the most developed platform by far is the XDK, which is also where it comes from, right? So this, much like many other Eclipse projects, came out of Bosch and started as a means to make programming the XDK easier, and this is really sort of the main driver still. In that sense, it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? So we're trying to get new platforms on board, and we are actually talking to other vendors, none of which is publicly disclosable at this point. But we are eagerly looking for people who are keen and interested in building platforms for Mita.
And it's actually not very hard. Like once you've got the basic stuff set up, you can just write C generators in Java, and that's pretty doable.
Well, I think the point is that you do not want to do that for each and every variant of the platform. Yeah, for example, in Arduino, in the IDE, you can pull in all these libraries that basically are targeting specific subtypes of the general ESP platform, for example, or the particular set of sensors that you have on there. So that you don't need to do all of this over and over again. Yes. Do you have a similar concept for writing these platforms? So the platform at its very base sort of describes, so in Mita, a platform is two things similar to in what the Arduino is. On one hand, it's sort of the actual platform definition that Mita uses to provide configuration, etc. And it's also the generators which implicitly describe how, like what operating system is used, what libraries are used, how time works on the platform, etc. And this you need to do for, say, every hardware family. So say an ESP8266, and you would have to do it for that one, but then like Node MCU and all the different variants of that, you wouldn't have to do it again, right? You could reuse that. And the same goes for libraries. So say you had MQTT support for an ESP8266, then you could reuse that again across those different variants. So you wouldn't have to build that for each variant individually. Arduino is a tough nut to crack on that, because they've basically killed that combinatory explosion of platforms and libraries by sheer effort. Right, so they're like the, say, HTTP support that you get on an ESP8266, you might still get sort of the same code reused on an ESP32, but the moment you go to something like Arduino Uno, it's something completely different. Right? We can't also, like, on that level of difference, sort of, we can't solve that as well.
Yes?
When you say that it transpiles to C, you're obviously expecting some kind of base level support in the, I guess, the libraries that come with any reference port you want to target. What is kind of the minimum expectations you have of this? I.e., how low can you push it?
So we have
C99, right?
Yeah. So it's more like that we expect certain concepts to be there, and then how you implement them is up to you. So for example, the event loop is something that can be implemented in many different ways. If you have something like FreeRTOS available, then you might want to use a FreeRTOS queue of function pointers to implement that. If you don't have any RTOS available, then you might want to have a main loop and Boolean flags that trigger the events, which is how the Arduino platform is implemented. When it comes to sort of functions that, or like, say a libc or something that we expect.
I think we have some basic expectations, like we need memcopy and stuff, but nothing wild, like C99, no GNU extensions, readable code is what we are trying to produce, and we're trying to do minimum necessary things.
No, there's no malloc or free. We have it. So I think the dependencies really are something like math.h and string.h, and that's pretty much where it ends.
Yeah, in types.
Oh yeah, std types. That is up to the platform. So Mita imposes a sort of structure on, or it imposes an order in which resources have to be configured, and it just computes that based on a topological sort of the dependencies of your configuration. But then how that boot actually happens, again, is up to the platform. In the XDK 110, it is, we start a task, a FreeRTOS task, and then initialize it in there. On Arduino, we don't have tasks, so we follow the setup loop mechanism, and our boot up happens in setup, and then the main loop is the loop function.
So we are also using the XDK in our demonstrator these days here, but we've used the implementation with C++.
C, yeah.
But now my question is for your demonstrator here, so which sensors did you evaluate for detecting that someone comes in? Only the temperature, or it was on the light sensor? Or?
So
you mean this demo or the very first one?
No, this one.
This one is an extension from Panasonic, which I think they're no longer producing, but we had some prototypes lying around.
Okay.
But this is an infrared 8x8 array. For the first demo, we just used the built-in light sensor and temperature sensor. So most of the XDK sensors are implemented at the moment, and things like this one just talks over I2C, so I do the readout manually. And you can use Mita with the XDK in the current workbench. So 3.4 and 3.5 is going to ship an updated version.
Can you repeat the question? Why is it better to use Mita with cloud-based devices? Was that your question?
You have introduced at the beginning doing cloud development and embedded this kind of two different worlds.
Yes.
Why is it better with Mita?
I understand. The motivation for that introduction is that we found while building the XDK, one of our assumptions was that, well, people know C, people are embedded developers, they'll be fine. But as it turns out, a lot of people sort of came from the cloud world, were doing Internet of Things, and then all of a sudden realized they needed things in their internet, and started wanting to use the XDK, but didn't have a C or embedded background. And this really provided, or proved to be, a hard entry barrier towards the adoption of those devices. And so this sort of two worlds coming together, embedded and cloud, is not so much a technological challenge as it is a people challenge. Right? It is that we have people with a Java or TypeScript background all of a sudden sort of almost forced to do low-level embedded stuff. That's one barrier that we want to lower.
Do you support other protocols apart from HTTP and MQTT?
The XDK 110 also has lightweight M2M support, also in Mita.
Is it strictly lightweight M2M, or would also plain co-op work?
Strictly lightweight M2M at this point.
But that's sort of a matter of what's most requested. Like, for example, recently people requested authentication a lot for MQTT. So if there's lots of interest in other protocols, then I guess it's going to be implemented, right? It's just not done yet.
We do expect that you ship your own, yes.
So therefore, the question is, what are you expecting in order for the high-level codes, for example, like the MQTT codes to work? What are you actually expecting in terms of the IP stack? You must have an assumption about what that looks like.
The abstraction level of Mita is one step above that, so to speak. So if you wanted MQTT, if you wanted to have MQTT on your platform, you would describe an MQTT resource, and sort of the handover between the Mita code and your platform happens the moment someone tries to write, say, to an MQTT topic. And then how you do that and how you use your TCP/IP stack is up to the C code that you generate.
You could.
You could.
It's a matter of defining it in your platform file. Like MQTT right now only exists in the XDK 110 platform. It doesn't exist in Arduino Uno because there are no platform generators for it, and it's not in the platform definition. If you have on your own platform a TCP/IP stack that you want to expose, you can define a system resource for that, and then you can access it.
But there's no kind of cascading expectations downstream from
No.
No.
You can
Purposefully. So actually, this marks the first year anniversary of Mita being out there. Like last year at EclipseCon, we announced that it was going to become open source. And ever the thought of this becoming open source has been sort of in the development of what was then called XDK Live from the very get-go. And so we've really taken care to not build any sort of implicit XDK assumptions into what we expect the platform to have. Right.
But it also means that you have to bring your own MQTT stack.
Correct. Yeah. But then we find with a lot of the hardware there is
there's an SDK and that has all the stacks in it.
There's good libraries already out there. No need to rebuild that, right?
You just want to understand.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.